The presentation that the commission requested, and we will start with we'll just go through the process from start to finish with the staff members and their thoughts and how the decision was made.
Lisa Lowy, Administrative Services Director for the City of Livingston. I just want to speak to what the process normally is and how we handle special events that are conducted in the city, just so everyone has a good background as to what that process looks like. The Administrative Services team acts as a liaison with all departments. We receive all special event applications. We make sure that all of the insurance policies are there, all of the possible contingencies are filled out in a form before it goes out to all department heads to look at in regards to any safety concerns, public safety concerns, any of those matters. So it's a collaborative opportunity for all of us to get together and understand what a special event could mean in our community and what it could mean for traffic, public safety, our first responders, and how they do their jobs. We handle between 40 and 50 special events applications per year, as well as approximately 100 special events that do not rise to the level of needing a special events application. Special events applications are required when you are expecting more than 300 people at any one event. You're looking for a street closure, or you're serving food or alcohol at an event, just to be clear kind of what our parameters are. This allows us to let all of our public safety entities know when there's going to be a large concentration of folks in one area, especially in light of alcohol, food, and other things that can inevitably make situations not go so well. With regards to the parade application, we held a meeting on May 31st of 2018 with members of the Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors, as well as various department heads, both police chief, fire chief, public works director, and our streets coordinator was there as well. In that meeting, we discussed that MDT had pulled back all of its assistance and liability coverage for closures on Park Street. This was effective with 2018. We explained that the city was not in a position to assume that liability and assume that risk without the support and the umbrella coverage provided by MDT. We explained in that meeting that moving forward in subsequent years, this would be the position as well. This year, the Chamber submitted an application to us that included Park Street closure as part of the parade route. They were advised when they submitted it that this would likely not be approved based on our conversations last year, based on the fact that MDT had not changed its stance at all, and that with the high concentration of 10 to 12,000 people they were expecting for the parade, this would pose an undue risk to close Park Street. They were notified formally that after we had gone through our process, that was indeed the case, that we would not approve a parade route that included a closure of Park Street. They were invited to submit another alternative parade route and were advised to do that by May 10th. Late in the day on May 10th, a parade route alternate was submitted that included Yellowstone Street as an alternative. The city did not suggest Yellowstone Street at any time. We simply stated that any alternative route should not include Park Street because we were not comfortable with the ramifications of that closure. Any questions on that process?
I do have one. Between last year's May meeting and May 31st, and you said May 10th of this year?
May 10th is when they submitted the alternative route. Ms. Feigl dropped off the application in late April.
So between May 31st of last year and April. So were there other communications between the city and the chamber?
On other events, yes. Park County Days.
On the route?
On the route of the parade, no.
Any meetings or any organized planned meetings at all?
No.
Any other Commissioner, questions?
I have a question. I'm curious, and I don't know if you're the right person to ask this to, Lisa. Because I keep hearing liability being talked about. What are we talking about? When we talk about liability, who does it fall on? What are the responsibilities of that liability if something were to happen?
Do you want to expand on the liability issue that you just brought up with MDT?
I certainly can.
Is it someone else who, I don't know who should answer?
I can, and certainly, Jay or Mike can chime in as well. If there were to be an incident that resulted in injury, loss of life, some sort of catastrophic incident, it would be the sole liability of the city of Livingston, i.e. its citizens, to settle any claims that arose out of that, especially if we were found to be negligent in terms of closing a state highway. And that could be anything, a delay of service in getting through to the hospital, which is now located on the extreme east end of town, or an accident of someone, missing the detour or missing the fact that the road is closed and plowing into the parade.
That's helpful. I think the liability is the top, a word that keeps getting brought up, so I just want to have a deeper understanding. Sometimes with events, it gets complicated when there's lots of parties involved, so just to be clear, I assume Jay will hopefully chime in at any point if clarity needs to be brought to any of these topics, or, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Jim?
So I can coattail what Lisa just stated. The special use permit for state maintained highways that the city as the applicant needs to fill out, and that needs to be approved by the district maintenance supervisor, which is Kyle DeMars in this case, requires the city to provide adequate insurance coverage, hold MDT harmless for all claims, actions, damages as a result of this activity, provide traffic control that complies with the manual of uniform traffic control devices that is approved by Kyle as the maintenance chief, and then reimburse the state for any damages done to the detour route on the MDT highway system. So that is all in the special use permit for state maintained highways that MDT requires the city to close Park Street. So when Public Works receives the special event apps from the Administrative Services Department, we look at it from various perspectives and responsibilities. Certainly first and foremost, public health and safety, any issues in that realm. A second important one is there any conflicts with this activity based on current construction projects or utility companies doing rehab like Northwestern Energy, making sure that no conflicts there. Street closures, making sure there's vehicle access, emergency service access, looking at garbage collection, cleanup from these events, certainly anything that involves park operations, and then other possibilities if the proposed route certainly is not approved by the city administration. So in the event of the route that was proposed on May 10th, the Yellowstone calendar Main, Public Works looked at all those street widths, intersection widths, and approved that route based on street widths. Alternative routes that we looked at, certainly we've proven that Second Calendar and Main Street all have adequate widths. B Street also has an adequate width. Lewis and even Clark, last year's route went up Second Street like down Calendar to B Street, down to Clark, back onto Main, and completed that. So there are no issues with any street widths, intersection, sizes for parade routes, certainly in the downtown corridor. As far as traffic control for the detour, we do not have the staff, we do not have the traffic control signs to do that. So I reached out to Mountain West Holdings, who is, they're a contractor that has done every Fifth Street crossing detour route for MRL when they've done work on the crossing. Brandon there, I've worked with him before on other projects, said it's gonna be about $4,000 just to get his crew over here, and it could be as much as $8,000 to set up the detour. Based on our two transportation plans that we've done over the last couple of years, you know, we fully expect to see about 742 vehicles per hour, or about 2,230 vehicles in a 3-hour closure that would be using this detour route. Our street department, we've gone on record, certainly, we're short-staffed this year. Just with any proposed route south of Park Street typically puts us in putting out traffic control in anywhere from 20 to 24 locations. And we're at maximum capacity to do that, plus provide the street sweeping and cleanup for after the parade, which is the department staff. So that is what we look at from a public works perspective in the special events act. Happy to answer any questions.
I have a question, but I'd like to hear from others. Any other questions? Lauren?
How was some street closings handled previously? Or I should say Park Street specifically.
All I can tell you, Commissioner Baby, is that Public Works did not have any involvement with the closures for Park Street. Yes.
Thank you.
I have a question then. Would you restate the requirements from the MDT, that list that you gave?
Yes. So, requires approval through the MDT's special use permit for state maintained highways. Requires the city to provide adequate insurance coverage, hold MDT harmless from all claims, actions, or damages as a result of the proposed activity, provide traffic control that complies with the manual use of traffic control devices that is approved by the maintenance chief, reimburse the state for any damages to the roadway.
Thank you, and then, so what is, because they're requiring that liability coverage then goes on to the city,
Yes.
correct? From what you're saying, they're saying they're not responsible, their liability coverage is not responsible for any closures, right?
Correct.
Okay,
And
so,
certainly Jay could probably elaborate more on really what a hold harmless statement above and beyond that includes as well.
Jay, do you wanna explain
This is
that?
basically a free pass to the state if something goes bad, is what it is. We incur a lot more liability on the city of Livingston and citizens.
I couldn't hear what he was saying.
Couldn't hear.
It's basically just a free pass for the state, if something does go wrong on Park Street. And it would make the city of Livingston and its citizens responsible.
Okay, and then, what in the past have we done as far, this might be one of you, I'm thinking, on liability coverage, what have we done? And what is required of us when we have an event from our insurance?
In the past, that liability was taken on by the state.
And this year, they chose not to.
Starting last year, they chose not to.
Do we know why?
I think they no longer desire to have that liability.
No, I know.
Jill, can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes.
Do you do either of you know if this was, from the Department of Transportation, if this was a change statewide, or if it's specific to Livingston?
No, it is their statewide policy.
So change for everyone across the state.
You know, we have a great working relationship with Kyle, and Jeff Ebert is the district manager, and, you know, obviously I've had a lot of discussions with Kyle over the last month. And, you know, Livingston is not the first community within his jurisdiction that has had to alter parade routes due to this updated policy from the state government.
Okay, any other questions? Okay. And who's up next?
Good evening, McInnes Fire Chief, Livingston Fire Rescue. My primary concern for the city and the county is the provision of emergency services in a timely manner. There's a phrase in the medical field that says time is muscle. What that means is that from the onset of insult to the definitive interventional care, any delay in response means that there's going to be more damage caused to that patient. For us, any unnecessary delay to respond can increase that time is muscle problem. Our response area is heavily weighted to the south side of the city and the South County. We respond up to the Shields Valley, Wilson Clyde Park, but most of our calls are south of B Street and down into the valley. Our response area includes the city, Paradise Valley, Immigrant, Prairie, Tom Minor Basin, and the I-90 corridor from county line to county line. We respond to all of that. Any kind of blockage of Park Street impairs our ability to respond in a timely manner to the south. It also impairs our ability to respond back to the hospital in a timely manner. If we can't get through on Park, we can't get through. Trying to go around using an alternative route such as going out to 337 and 333 to respond adds 8 miles one way. If we have to respond back, we're looking at 16 miles of extra unnecessary distance during an emergency response. There's no guarantee that if Park was used as a parade route, that we could get through. Vehicle coming around a corner could break down. There could be a backup somewhere on the parade route that backs up vehicles onto Park. We have people on both sides of the street, and in front of the depot, you have a very small area where people can stand. It's probably less than 3 feet wide in front of the sidewalk. Getting an emergency vehicle through there on an emergent response could be very, very dangerous. I've lived in a community with a poorly designed parade route. That's exactly what happened. An ambulance going through on an emergency response hit a child. The child did not survive. That devastated that community for years. The underpass, 5th Street, front, 5th and front, we can't use those. As Shannon mentioned, we're looking at 400 cars an hour for Shannon, what was the total number?
Or about 730 cars per hour.
Yeah, so 2,100 cars during the parade route, plus setup and takedown time afterwards. We could be looking at 3.5, 4 hours where Front Street is not accessible and Park is not accessible. That leaves us with 5 hours, potentially 5 hours of not being able to respond to the majority of our calls. To respond to the south, if Park Street was used as a parade route, would mean that we would have a non-emergent response to an emergent situation. We would have to go to the barricades, wait for them to be moved, drive slowly through the parade route, waiting for people to get out of the way, waiting for floats to move, and then we could have our emergency response once we're clear of the parade route. It's great for the people standing on the side of the road, they're safe. The person having the emergency is not being treated properly. Any questions?
Commissioners? Warren?
Previously, were there personnel and equipment staged at either end of Park beyond the,
I do not have staff to stage people around town. I have 3 people on duty. Once they stay at the station so they can respond anywhere. To bring in people and stage them around means I'm bringing in people on overtime, on their days off, canceling their vacation to do it. If I stage somebody south of the parade route and something happens on the north side, we have the same problem.
so that hasn't been done previously?
No, sir, it has not.
Thank you.
Melissa?
I was gonna ask that too, if there were extra staff on during those 3 days, but it sounds like the answer is no. And then, just to clarify, and thank you first for offering all this information, it sounds like we're not talking about north of the tracks, we're talking about the majority of your calls are on the south of the track and on the other side of Main Street, on the other side of B Street, really.
The majority of our calls are in the Old Town. We don't run a lot of calls to the north side of the tracks. The majority of our calls are on this side of the tracks, south of B Street, down into the valley.
Thank you.
You might have any other questions, a little later, but thank you.
Hello. Dale Johnson, Livingston Police Department. Just to be clear, the only aspect of the parade route that I was opposed to is using Park Street. Personally, I would prefer the parade stay on Second Calendar Main. I'll get into why a little bit later, but for us, it works a whole lot better if we focus on the downtown area. And that was my preference. The Chamber proposed Yellowstone, and if that's the route that it's taken, you know, we'll figure it out as far as our response. So last year, when the parade was off of Park Street, I was attempting to drive from the east side of town to the west side of town. As I was doing that, about from TJ's all the way past the 7th Street light, it was bumper to bumper traffic the entire way in both directions. Everybody was stopping at all the traffic lights, and you couldn't go anywhere, and it took me 15 to 20 minutes to get across Park Street as is. They're expecting, 12,000 people here this year, so there's no reason to think that the traffic would be any different this year than it was last year. If all that traffic is diverted onto the north side of the tracks through the underpass, Front Street, down 5th, it's still gonna be bumper to bumper traffic. We all know how difficult it is to get from the north side to the south side under the underpass when there's a little bit of traffic going on. 5th Street, it would be another pinch point as far as traffic trying to get north or south of there, anything of that nature, and it makes it extremely difficult for anybody to try to respond. Let alone, I guess, if there was a train passing by, then all traffic north, south, east, west would be stopped. Then there would be no other route. There was a map that showed a detour route for emergency services south of the parade. That included River Drive and View Vista Drive, but those are where the staging areas are. That's where the parade starts, that's where the parade finishes, everybody goes. It would be dangerous for emergency responder to try to use that route when there's kids excited, there's horses, there's all kinds of things going on. It would be inappropriate to try to use that as emergency response route. There was a quote in the paper that the event is an incident-free history. That's great for whoever has an incident-free part of it, but that doesn't apply to us. The parade and those 3 days are extremely busy for us. During the parade, we routinely get calls to the things that are happening at the parade route. We've had verbal arguments. That happens just about every year. People upset about seating, about chairs, whatever the circumstances. We get those all the time. Intoxicated people who are being belligerent and causing a ruckus, that happens routinely. Officers have to respond to deal with that. Physical fights, there was one just a couple of years ago, people actually physically fighting on the parade route. Officers have to respond to that, and one officer responding is never a safe thing, so we try to get as many as we can to respond to those types of calls. One year we had an intoxicated person run out into the middle of the parade route because he wanted to pet on one of the horses. You probably can tell that freaked the horse out, freaked the rider out, and caused some issues there. He ended up being arrested and taken to the jail. We get calls routinely of missing children. Thankfully, every case so far has been just a child wandering off and being separated from the parent, but we don't go under that assumption. We assume that something nefarious has happened and we respond accordingly. Medical calls, usually there's some sort of medical call in the downtown. We have officers stationed every block along the parade route for reasons that if somebody needs something, there's an officer near. We also have officers who are on bikes who are able to patrol the area and the surrounding areas for any issues. With medical calls, our bike patrol officers are typically the first people there. They usually help the ambulance by moving the spectators out of the way, making room for the ambulance to come in, or, which has happened sometimes, is they actually extricate the patient out to the ambulance because the ambulance can't get all the way into the parade. So that's some of the stuff that the guys around the parade route do. We do have officers who also patrol on both sides of the city. We have one officer in a patrol car on the west side. We have one officer patrolling in a car on the east side. And then we have one or two officers who we call them floating. They go from the east side to the west side to the north side to the best of their ability. Those officers, typical calls that we get are parking complaints. Every year we get numerous parking complaints. People are blocking driveways. People are blocking alleys, making it unsafe for anybody to try to respond. Animals being left inside of parked vehicles during a hot July 2nd day. So that's something that we have to try to take care of. One year we had an officer find somebody who is actively crawling through a window of a house. Everybody's downtown watching the parade, a lot of empty houses. So that officer had to respond to that and deal with that alone because he was the one person on that one side of the town. Personally, I had to respond to a active physical domestic disturbance that was occurring, and it was on the north side of the tracks. I was on the south side, on the east side, trying to get across 5th Street up to that. It was time consuming. There was an excessive delay just trying to get to this to stop the violence when this woman was being physically assaulted by her boyfriend. That's the kind of stuff that we deal with. I took some stats just on the past 4 years of calls, July 2nd, from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Just made some notes of some notable ones. 2018, we had one disturbance on the parade. We had the officers who taking calls, because we deal with our typical calls still, they come in. They had to deal with a suicidal person who was in crisis at that time. So we had officers had to respond to a suicidal person. We had a missing child on the parade route, and then we got a call of a suspicious person around another house. 2017, we had a couple of crashes. Not that that's a big thing, but they're time consuming. So we got one officer on one side of the town dealing with a car crash because we still want to offer that customer service. It's time consuming and ties up the officers. 2017 still, we had animals left in the vehicles, and then one that I found interesting is says, City 4, which is an officer, flagged down by a bus driver who had a box of blood for Livingston Healthcare, and due to the parade was unable to get to it. So City 4, the officer, had to take the blood, do the detour, take the route, and finally did get it to the hospital. 2016, we had 3 disturbances on the parade route. One of them was a physical fight between 2 people, ended in arrests. Again, that year, officers had to deal with a suicidal person having suicidal ideations. So we had to try to respond to that. And then accidents. There was a call that I found, again, interesting that pertains to this. It says City 3, again, another city officer, advised he would be out with a traffic jam at 5th and Front and then the problem was resolved after he got out and dealt with it. 2015, animals and vehicles, kids actually on the parade route, running out into the parade, causing disturbance there, and kind of shocked me, but in 2015 also, officers had to deal with a suicidal person. So, for 3 out of those 4 years, officers who were not directly downtown dealing with the parade are trying to deal with suicidal individuals. So, and then there was another accident that year. So based on not only my concerns and my personal experience from the traffic jams, the delays and trying to get to places, but also the experiences of the fire chief, I think the option of keeping Park Street open is the only safest route. By doing that, it'll keep all the tourists and the daily traffic on Park Street. During an emergency, it'll allow emergency vehicles to use Front Street, underpass 5th Street, to save time. If there happens to be a train, then we're going to be stuck on Park Street, and our delays will be lessened. So, increased. And again, I would prefer, just because we do have officers stationed at every block along the way, if there's an incident, a major incident during the parade, by the parade staying on 2nd Street and Main Street, we can have more officers respond to that area quicker. If it's on Yellowstone, there's a 3-block difference that officers may have to sprint to or something of that nature, because it's unrealistic to think that a car could be parked in there to drive back and forth. So the only thing, my only concern out of all of this is the safety of the community. I assume that that's what the community is wanting as well. By moving the parade 1 block to the south, that'll help accomplish that goal. That was the only thing that my thought process was, move that block in the parade 1 block to the south, help emergency responders get to where they need to go during an emergency. So when we get calls of someone in a crisis, someone having suicidal ideations, officers can respond in a timely manner without an unnecessary delay. When there's an active physical domestic assault occurring, officers can respond to the call and stop the violence without having to wait for the traffic jam at 5th Street or the underpass. That's where I'm coming from. That's why the decision that I ultimately made, I made. Honestly, there's probably going to be some backlash, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm kind of disheartened that it seems that some members of our community care more about the parade route being moved 1 block than about emergency services' ability to respond to a 911 call. I would hope that somebody having suicidal thoughts or a woman being physically assaulted by her boyfriend would be a greater concern than the parade moving 1 block. That's all I have.
Thank you, Dale.
Any questions?
I have a question, and this may be Ken or you on, so in consideration of keeping Park Street open, have you discussed possibly preventing parking on Park Street so there's easier access for not being total traffic blocking of just backed up cars? Because then cars on the side, and then how do,
We have not, that discussion's not happening.
sort of fruitless if your traffic's blocking our thoroughfare anyway.
Correct.
So that hasn't been discussed or thought?
About keeping the traffic,
Like
no
having
parking on Park Street during that time?
On parts of it so that cars can get by.
We have not had that discussion yet. Why not?
Anyone else have, Melissa, do you have a question?
I guess the same question that I asked the other chief, do you have extra staff on for those?
Everybody
days?
works. All of our officers work, regardless if they worked the night before or they worked that night, all of our officers work. Yes.
So we have to bump up our police coverage, correct? I mean, more more than usual or same? Equal to
I'm not
what
sure
we-
what you're asking. Every parade, every officer works.
Okay, so we don't do that with ambulance though? We don't have more coverage for ambulance during the parade or during?
Sounded like no.
Probably the whole day. It could be most of the day, any one of those days for various reasons. We have a lot going
I
on.
can't answer for Ken, but during the parade, like I said, every officer works. During the rodeo, the second, third, and fourth, those nights, we have three additional officers working, because as soon as the parade's done, they all go downtown to the bars. So yes, we have 3 additional officers working each of those nights also.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Welcome. Thanks.